The next stop is Avenue J.
This is a difficult topic in some ways because the Chazon Ish represents an ideal in contemporary Jewish society, particularly Brooklyn Jewish society. And although he is really a phenomenal, heroic figure of towering proportions, it's considered somewhat sacrilegious even to discuss him as if you were a regular human being. So I will do my best to try and assuage the concerns of the community. I will tell you that I am a big fan of the Chazon Ish. We have on our wall, in one of the walls in our home, we have 3 rabbis' photographs, Rebbe pictures that people put up there as people that are inspirational to myself, my wife, and we hope to our children. And one of them is the Chazon Ish. He is really an incredible individual, and so we've actually put a picture of him on our wall. I just want to say that I personally have a connection to the Chazon Ish, an emotional, intellectual, spiritual connection, but I'm also a historian, so I'd like to try and give you some of the contours of his life, and I think that the more we learn the details of the difficulties that he endured, the challenges that he faced, we will see more of his greatness at the same time. So first of all, the Chazon Ish, it's a pseudonym, obviously. The word Chazon in Hebrew means vision. It's a term that you find mainly in the Bible, in Tanakh, being associated with prophets. I think Chazon Yeshayahu, for example, the vision of Isaiah, it's a lofty word for vision. It's meaning like vision, like we say, a person has vision in the sense of perspective and the sense of consequence and things like that. And the word Ish in Hebrew, of course, means man, but it is an acronym of his first 2 names, Abraham Yeshayahu, Ish, the Aleph for Abraham and the Yud Shin for Yeshayahu. So the term Chazon Ish means the vision of a man, or perhaps a man of vision, but that's the term that he invariably used for his publications from his youth, and as a result, he's known as simply the Chazon Ish. It's also the name of his massive work on halakha, on Jewish law. So as is the thing that happens quite often in Jewish history, in Jewish literature, the convention is that when a person writes a really famous work, they become identified with that work itself. For example, hardly ever anyone refers to Rabbi Yisrael Meir HaKohen. They refer to the Chafetz Chaim, right? Because he wrote such a phenomenal work that he is identified with that work so closely. I can only imagine what people would call me if anyone ever read my book that much. I actually write quite a bit under a pseudonym. You may have seen it, Stephen King. He's kind of, okay. Anyways, his years are 1878 to 1953. I lived through the tumultuous first half of the 20th century, and in many ways he shaped the second half and continues to shape our existence today in the modern world. I'm relying principally on 2 sources. The first is this biography published by Art Scroll by Rabbi Shimon Finkelman. Well written, fascinating. I actually read it twice. I really did enjoy it. I got a lot of personal inspiration out of it. It is, however, within the category of hagiography, meaning it's a book that is written as an homage, a book that's written as a tribute to the subject, not intended to be a historically critical, analytical kind of history with multiple viewpoints and things like that. It's really a book that extols the great virtues of the Chazon Ish, and we will explore those over the next 40 minutes or so as well. But I've also relied on some academic work by Dr. Benjamin Brown of Hebrew University, fascinating and very well-read scholar. He produced this massive biography, an astounding 965 pages of Hebrew prose. And Hebrew, as you know, it's a very compressed language. So if we're translating into English, it would probably be upwards of 3,000 pages, a massive biography. Without doubt, the critical hands down, nobody is ever going to write another biography of the Chazon Ish for 100 years kind of book. And there's some absolutely phenomenal perspectives on the Chazon Ish that you won't get in the hagiographical literature, such as the volume I showed you earlier, or the very famous Pe'er Ador, a very important Hebrew language biography of the Chazon Ish. Dr. Brown takes advantage of multiple testimonies. There are a lot of famous people who knew the Chazon Ish even in his youth. For example, the great Yiddish writer Chaim Grada was his student, and Chaim Grada later wrote quite a bit about the Chazon Ish, a very famous eulogy as well. But he approaches it like an academic historian rather than a believer or a follower, and so it has a different tone to it altogether. Nevertheless, I think there's a lot of material that we can glean from both of these sources to get a critical, well, maybe not critical, a fuller introduction to the life of this phenomenal scholar. Okay, those are my sources. So let's go just a little back. I want to situate him within the Jewish religio-philosophical world. I realize for many of you this will be boring, repetitive, but for the rest of you perhaps it will be useful. And you know, we do have over 600 people in Latvia who are enjoying these lectures, so I have to give you some major context. So the term Orthodox is actually a term that was, the Chazon Ish, of course, is associated with the ultra-Orthodox, with the Haredi movement, very powerful in Israel, very powerful here in Brooklyn, not too far away in Lakewood, New Jersey, and many other centers around North America. So we want to understand, where does exactly this come from? What is this movement, the Haredi movement? The term Orthodox, of which Haredi is a subset, is a 19th century term that was actually applied as a term of opprobrium, of criticism of the Orthodox movement by the Reform movement, the early Reform movement, who wanted to portray the traditionalist Jews as being rigid and uniform, monochromatic. In Greek, the word orthodox means one doctrine, one way, as if to say that these Jews only know one way to be Jewish, whereas the rest of us enlightened modern thinkers have so many different ways to be Jewish. But if we try to break down this term Orthodox, we'll see that it actually can be translated into a spectrum. So the history of the Orthodox, so to speak, has a major breaking point at the turn of the 19th century with the French Revolution. Up until 1791, when Jews in Europe were emancipated formally, in France in particular, and then over the next 100 years, the rest of the continent, Jews constituted one basic community, one kehila. If they had to attach a name to themselves, they were often called the Altgläubiger, which means the old believers, meaning this is what we do as Jews. We have Shabbos, we have Kashrus, we have things like that. There were certainly Jews who were nonconformist, were non-compliant. It is a fallacy to think that the off-the-derrick phenomenon is something modern. It is definitely a much larger phenomenon today for reasons that we'll explore in a second, but it was certainly not unknown prior to the emancipation of Jews in 1791. However, with 1791, all of a sudden a totally new possibility was exposed for Jews, and that was the sanctioned departure from community norms. Meaning, prior to 1791, you had one Jewish community with one Jewish court, you had one authority structure, and yeah, people did what they wanted. People, you know, perhaps were not so careful with Shabbos in their home, perhaps were not so careful with kashrus, especially when they're traveling and Chinese food was readily available. But still, there was a sense that you were transgressing the norm. You were definitely not doing what the community tolerated. It happened, but it was always considered something that was sub rosa. With 1791 and the dissolution of the authority of the traditional rabbinate, they no longer had coercive power like they did when they constituted a duly legitimate legislative and judicial body within the various states that the Jews lived. Then Jews had the freedom to say, hey, you know, why should we affiliate with the traditional community? Let us create our own associations which do not have the boundaries of halakha. And so you have the growth of socially sanctioned antinomian movements that coalesce around synagogues or temples that do not conform to the standards. We'll see some of those in a second. So basically, Germany is the epicenter of these movements. You have a movement called the liberal movement. It is now in America called the Reform. That's essentially the extension of it. And this is a movement that in many ways challenged traditional halakha in terms of the Sabbath and kosher laws and many other things. And then there's a break-off from the liberal movement in the 1840s, which is called at that time historical positivist or the conservative movement, as it's known today in America. There are several other smaller groups which we won't go into today. But then you have several groups who also stay within the norm of halakha, but yet they express it very differently. And these are the three groups we have to look at. The first are the Hasidim, which are actually modern Jewry's first reform movement because they challenged the Talmudic elite in Lithuania proper. The Misnagdim, the so-called opponents of the Hasidic movement, who are the Talmudic traditionalists. And finally, the so-called neo-Orthodox or modern Orthodox that were primarily expressed in Germany. So looking at this chart, we basically have one Jewish community with a more or less compliant population, a lot of people who maybe would not be observing Jewish law, but there's really not much choice other than converting to another religion, let's say Christianity. And then there's like a huge seam in time with the change of the French Revolution that creates several different movements. Two that are definitely contra halacha in the sense of, well, there's a lot to say about that. And three which fight with each other quite bitterly sometimes, but nevertheless see themselves as being within the purview of traditional halacha. If I can put it in a slightly different way, we have a spectrum of Jewish religious movements, and this, I think, can express us even in the 21st century. You have on the left, let's say, openness, the idea that outside society is not at all toxic to Jews, that Jews can participate actively in non-Jewish politics, music, art, what have you. And on the right, you would have insularity, a feeling that Jews must close off the world outside, must try and limit exposure to various non-Jewish cultural influences and so on. And there's a big dividing line here, which is this one basic theological idea: are there 613 commandments or not? Meaning, does the Torah have the sanctity of being given by God exactly as we have it today? More or less, I'm kind of like paraphrasing. So on the right of that movement, you have, on the left, you have the Reform and the Conservative, let's say, who are on that spectrum that way. And on the right of the 613, you have the so-called modern Orthodox and the Haredim. And this brings us back to the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish is very much associated with the Haredi movement. The term Hared means to tremble in the sense of to be God-fearing, to tremble at the word of God. It's actually derived from a verse in Isaiah. And the Haredim generally come in two flavors. They are either the traditionalist Lithuanians, known as the Litvaks, or the Yeshivish community, because they are associated with the great yeshivas of Lithuania, or they are the Hasidim, with one major exception that's very difficult to really capture, and that is, of course, Chabad. Chabad is an unusual movement. Theologically, it definitely tends to be on the Haredi end of the spectrum, but in terms of its practices, it's quite often very open to modern technology, the use of modern technology. Trying to put the Chabad on this spectrum is like putting Donald Trump on a political spectrum. It's also very difficult. So that's where we are. We're going to talk about the Chazon Ish, who is one of the most important figures in the Haredi movement, specifically the Lithuanian Haredi movement, because that is his intellectual and cultural origins. Okay, so he was born in 1878 in White Russia, Belarus, which is really Lithuania. If you look at a map of Eastern Europe, I'm not going to bring one up right now, but if you look at a map of Eastern Europe, the Jewish cultural boundaries do not conform exactly with the political boundaries as we understand them. He was one of 9 from a distinguished rabbinic family. Many of his siblings went into rabbinic work as well. And he was a child prodigy. Ironically, he was, without doubt, the most important proponent of long-time yeshiva study, especially from childhood into adulthood, into kollel of the 20th century. And yet he himself never attended yeshiva, except for a very brief period of time that lasted less than a week when he was a child. He was sent off to yeshiva. He didn't like it very much. According to Dr. Brown, he was homesick and he wanted to come back home. He was just a young boy. And in fact, he stayed home. He was an exceptionally diligent individual, however, someone that they would call in the parlance of the yeshiva a masmid, meaning a perpetual student, very self-motivated, very self-disciplined. And he simply studied on his own or with his father or with cousins. He had tutors when he was very young, but he rapidly, like the Vilna Gaon, who in many ways was his intellectual progenitor, he simply taught himself, completely immersed in the texts, making his own way through them, and achieving brilliance without really the assistance of any institutional framework. When he was a young man, in his mid-20s, he married a woman named Basia Bey from not too far away in Lithuania, who supported him the rest of her life. She worked in a textile store. She had her own store. He just puttered around there occasionally when she needed an extra set of hands, and otherwise he was free to completely devote himself utterly and completely to the study of Torah. Anyways, they had a textile shop first in Lithuania. Then they suffered a terrible robbery at one point. The Chazon Ish and his wife were in bed in this tiny 2-room apartment, and they heard the robbers in the store that was next to them. But they were concerned about, would there be violence if they interrupted them while they were robbing. And then when they finally got up the next morning and left the room, and they saw that absolutely everything was taken. So at that point in 1933, they decided to make their way to Israel. And in Israel, she set up the same kind of business and supported him there as well. So what was the most important thing about the Chazon Ish? What was the leitmotif of this individual? If I can get across one thing in this lecture, it's that he was completely and utterly dedicated to the study of Torah. What's called in Lithuanian Hebrew, Torah lishma, Torah for its own sake. He believed that the study of Torah was the answer to absolutely everything, and that you could discover tremendous insights simply by studying the Torah in an extremely diligent manner. And not just insights about the Torah, but insights about so many other things. There are phenomenal, wonder-working stories surrounding the Chazon Ish, like one story, for example, and it's hard to know what to make of such stories. They don't really fall within the purview of the traditional documented sources that we use in history. But a father came to the Chazon Ish. His child was suffering from a brain tumor. The doctor said it was inoperable. And the Chazon Ish pulled out a piece of paper and drew a diagram of the brain and indicated exactly how the doctor should operate. The parents decided to go ahead and ask the doctor to operate. Anyways, the doctor, in fact, did, and deviated only a one small detail. The child survived and grew up to adulthood, had a family, and so on. But that one small detail that they deviated gave the child, I think, a terrible limp or something like that. So they asked the Chazon Ish, that's absolutely amazing. How is it possible that you, who spent your entire life just studying Torah, should know how to perform brain surgery? And he said that I simply studied the laws of the structure of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And from understanding, who knows on what level, the laws of how the Mishkan was constructed, you can make a connection to the structure of the brain. There are these amazing kind of miracle stories associated with them. Who knows? They don't tell such stories, as they say, about you or me, but they do tell them about the Chazon Ish. But as we shall see, the Torah was always at the core of any of his responses to the challenges of modernity, the idea of the absolute and utter dedication to Torah, no matter what the consequences. He was fearless in his representation of his interpretation of the Torah against figures who are far more well known than he, even from his youth. And I'll show you a couple of examples of those. So As I mentioned, his most famous work is a very large work, multi-volume work that he published already at the beginning of the 20th century, is the work called Sefer Chazon Ish, the Book of Chazon Ish. It's a very, very difficult work to render into English. In fact, I don't think there are any English translations, even of his tiny little book, which we'll talk about in a minute, called Emunah Bitachon. His Hebrew is incredibly ornate. It's not just old-fashioned. It's like incredibly convoluted and difficult, and he is not a generous writer. He abbreviates almost everything. He assumes that before you read his work, you have already mastered all of the other sources, and you're ready to simply dive into an advanced work. He gives nothing in terms of like introductions or discussions of the larger context of his ideas. It's really high-level, difficult work. Even his book, Emunah Bitachon, I might as well talk about it right now. Even his book, Emunah Bitachon, which means faith and trust, which again, I don't believe has been translated. Does anyone know if there's a translation of that? It's only about 60, 70 pages in Hebrew. In English, there is a book by, in Hebrew, yeah. There is a book called Faith and Trust by Rabbi Humaner. It's not the same book. It's a very difficult work to read. He does use modern vocabulary. He uses, for example, the word microbes. I just reread it on Shabbos for this lecture. Microbes, which in Hebrew is microbes, but the style is very lugubrious, difficult, ornate, complex, baroque, really, in the way he writes. He's almost writing only for himself, and other people happen to be able to listen in. But cognoscenti, people who know how to read this literature, are amazed with the kinds of things that he comes up with. His first volume appeared, I believe, in 1905. He had a lot of interesting things to say. In many ways, he commented on the Baylis drive, for example. He wrote a really interesting volume at that point. Emunah Bitachon is perhaps the most accessible of his works, which basically goes through a few short chapters about what exactly is faith, what exactly is trust in God. He takes issue with the Musar movement, which we've discussed in this room several times. The Musar movement, which looks at certain texts to emphasize self-development, and he felt these are very nice books, but they take away time from Torah study. If you're studying Rabbi Moshe Chaim Lutzatzo's Mesilas Yesharim or the Chovos HaLevavos or one of these other books, you're not studying regular Torah, which means basically Gemara. And he says that's a very nice thing that you can read perhaps when you're walking or not doing something important, but when you're really sitting down, you should be learning Gemara. His vision of emunah, of faith, is largely based on a deductive approach after wondering at the majesty of the world. He talks about the ecosystem on a scientific level. He talks about the wonders of the human hand. He talks about how amazing it is that the entire world is so interrelated and connected. And he says, basically, how can you not believe in God when you have a world like this around you? He gives a few examples of this nature. And his chapter on bitachon, perhaps, though, is the most moving and one that I occasionally reflect on myself. Bitachon is a word that is used in their Yiddish gas, in the Jewish street, to mean like, don't worry, everything will be okay, right? Have bitachon, just relax, chill, it'll work out. And he says there is a very mistaken interpretation of what bitachon is. Bitachon does not mean that it will all work out for the best for you. He says it could be disastrous for you. Bitachon is an attitude that whatever happens to you is not an accident. Bitachon is a trust that God is sending you a message. The message might be absolutely horrible. It could be awful, but it's nevertheless coming from God. So he's not necessarily a feel-good rabbi. He's not like someone who embraces you with warmth and gives you like kind of homilies. But on the other hand, he was a deeply beloved rabbi in Israel, and people would seek him out, come to his home till 4 a.m., petitioning him with all kinds of questions and requests for blessings and things like that. Let's look at some of his decisions that made such a big deal, because he was a really innovative thinker in Jewish law, and he shaped a lot of the things we do. For example, electricity, for example. Electricity was really just coming of its own. The Russian Empire, where he lived, wasn't even fully electrified until the 1930s, really. So in halacha, Jews were trying to figure out what exactly is electricity. I mean, is it fire? If it's fire, then it's forbidden. But on the other hand, it certainly doesn't seem like fire. It has some elements. So the rabbis were really arguing for a long time about what do we do with electricity? How do we understand its use on Shabbat? Sorry, forbidden on the Sabbath. Some rabbis had kind of like a halfway point of view where they said that, look, if it heats something up, like a filament in a light bulb, so that's like heat already. That's like fire. So we shouldn't use light bulbs. But something like an electric fan, why not? Right? It's not actually, it doesn't say in the Torah that a fan is forbidden. But the Chazon Ish concluded that because it completes a circuit, when you turn the switch on, you're completing an electric circuit with the electrons, I guess, transferring themselves down through the, I don't know what I'm talking about in science, but it creates a flow, a circuit of electricity. That is what makes it forbidden. So that's really common practice today, is that observant Jews do not turn on or off light switches which open or break a circuit, based on his ideas. Another really fascinating one that actually affected me as well, the date line controversy. This came up during the war when the Mir Yeshiva and other Jews had fled from Eastern Europe and were living in Shanghai and in Japan. And the real question is, because the world is round, you must have some point in the world where you say, okay, once you cross this line, it's now the next day. Otherwise, there's no way we can maintain one consistent date for the entire world, because the sun is 12 hours ahead of the other side of the world at any given moment in time. So the convention is to rely on this map here. This is what we have as the dateline, the international dateline, which happens to be, ironically, pretty much slicing the world in half, with Jerusalem on the other side. Jerusalem is called Tibur HaOlam, the navel of the world. So if you were to go exactly halfway around the world, you would pretty much get to the dateline. But a lot of rabbis were in doubt as to how that would affect, for example, Japan. So they pulled together in Israel, because there was a question, what do we do about Yom Kippur? It's one thing, what do you do about Shabbos? That's difficult enough. But what do we do about Yom Kippur? So they pulled together 23 rabbis in Israel during the war to debate this issue, and they did it on a fast day, the third day of Tzom Gedalia, the third day of Tishrei. I think it was 1943, 42, I'm not sure. And these 23 rabbis said, Thursday is Yom Kippur. Don't worry about the dateline. Thursday is Yom Kippur. And the Chazon Ish writes a telegram to all the Jews who were living in Japan and said, Wednesday is Yom Kippur. Fast on Wednesday, eat on Thursday, which takes a tremendous amount of, to use the Latin term, chutzpah, to go against the dominant opinion. But his feeling was that basically the edge of Asia is really where the dateline is. Since Japan constitutes a body of islands off the coast, they actually would be on the day before. So to this day, the Jews of Japan generally, who are mainly Chabad, the Jews of Japan observe Saturday as Shabbos, which is the opinion of the 23 rabbis in Israel, Rabbi Tukachinsky in particular. But the Chazon Ish says it really should be on Sunday. You should be observing Shabbos on Sunday. Hawaii is the other way. Jews in Hawaii observe Saturday as Shabbos, but the Chazon Ish says it should be Friday. Or maybe, no, it's Rabbi Tukachinsky. But at any rate, I can tell you a personal story here, which is kind of funny. I don't know if I'll put this on the internet. Here's a picture of me with my son Boaz in Japan. I was there for an academic conference once, and I was a little bit younger than you can see. I still have some dark colors in my beard. I'm wearing a traditional Japanese robe called a yakuta, and my son is wearing a traditional Japanese cloth called a diaper. And the funny story is, so we went to Japan for a few weeks when I was I don't remember when I was a postdoc or something, and we asked a shaila, a halakha question, what do we do about this whole Shabbos controversy? And the answer we received was that we should follow the opinion of the 23 rabbis and observe Shabbos on Saturday, but we should also follow the opinion of the Chazon Ish and not transgress anything on a Torah level on Sunday. So a regular Shabbos on Saturday, but on Sunday, only things which are forbidden by the Torah, which was actually a great learning experience. Like, for example, if you like turn on a light switch with your elbow, k'la'achar yad, that's rabbinically prohibited. So, okay, light switches, all right, like this on Sunday. Asking a non-Jew to do something on Shabbos is a rabbinic prohibition. So that meant on Sunday, we could have the non-Jewish people do things for us, like drive us around in a taxi, for example. And there are all kinds of ways in which we had like kind of that weird half Shabbos. I'll tell you one last funny story. At least funny to me, it's therapeutic. The Yakuta I wanted to mention. This is a weird thing. I don't know if I should put this on the internet. But in Japan, how many of you have been to Japan? Okay, so the rest of you, I can make up whatever I want. But basically, they like to sell things in twos. You know, they have very small families. They sell things in twos a lot. 2 cups, 2 forks, and one of them is always like a little bit bigger. You know, like the man's cup is a tiny bit bigger than the woman's cup. So that's just the way they do things. So when we were in the university in Hokkaido, and we were in the university residence for faculty, they brought my wife and I these really beautiful yakutas to wear, and they laid them out, folded really nicely. And the thing is, they were a little bit, my wife's fit perfectly, but mine was a little too long. And my wife and I are about the same height. So we explained with our Japanese dictionary, trying very hard to explain that, you know, could I get one the same size as her? And the maids were like really upset. Oh my gosh, what? Really, that would be such an affront to your masculinity. They didn't say it quite like that. But, you know, so we convinced them, and they brought me one that was the right size, and they brought my wife one that was smaller. All right. Okay. So anyways, that's true. Another example of the Chazon Ish's opinions, which was, you know, rocked the Jewish world as well. There's a lot more to say about this, but I'll try and make it quick. The very first question the Talmud asks, if you spend time studying Talmud, you know this is true. The Talmud always asks, what is the shear? What is the size of this problem? If you're saying, for example, you have to fast on Yom Kippur. So right away, okay, when is Yom Kippur? How long is Yom Kippur? What is eating? How much is eating? Is intravenous feeding eating? Is drinking eating? You know, you want to define the size of the problem. Sizes, shiurim, are extremely important in halakhic conditions because you want to know, have I fulfilled this mitzvah or not? In order to fulfill it, I need to know how big it is. I need to know what is required to actually do this. So the Talmud gives very rough sizes. It tends to use terms like an olive's bulk, or the volume of an egg, or a cheek full. And these are very kind of like loose measurements. How do you measure an olive's bulk? And what if they're bigger olives, smaller olives? What if it's different species of olives? So for much of Jewish history, we tended to do this just simply by Masorah, simply by what did my father do? And okay, that's the size of it. And if you look, for example, at artifacts from even the 19th century, see Kiddush cups are sometimes really tiny, tefillin are sometimes really tiny, things that would be considered unacceptable today, but that was the Masorah to go ahead and do those things. But in the 19th and especially the 20th century, largely because of the demographic losses of the Holocaust, where people could no longer look to what did my father do, how much bread did we eat, how much matzah did we eat, there was a desire to kind of codify these things and to set them down to what exactly is the measurement. So a lot of rabbis coalesced around the opinion of Rabbi Chaim Naeh, which described, for example, a revi'is as a measurement of volume of liquid as being somewhere around 3-4 ounces. But the Chazon Ish, he calculated everything bigger. And he said, no, that's not large enough for a revi'is. A revi'is would actually be more like 4.4 ounces. And so the Chazon Ish shiur, the size of the Chazon Ish, is associated in halakhic literature with something really big. It's always bigger than the norm, like this big esrog. 1933, as I mentioned, he made Aliyah. and he moved to the fairly backward and relatively unknown city of Bnei Brak. And he essentially is identified with Bnei Brak more than anyone else. And Bnei Brak is identified with the Chazon Ish. He really made that city famous. Incredible, transformation as a citadel of Torah, largely because he settled there. And all of a sudden, in Israel, he had phenomenal possibilities for halakhic creativity because there were so many questions that had not been addressed that now, with the beginning of a major settlement of Jews there, they actually could be relevant. For example, all these mitzvot, these commandments associated with the land, the priestly tithes, the trumos and maasros, like when you eat food that's grown in Israel, do you have to give part of it to a Kohen? How do you do that? How much do you do it? What do you say when you do it? He created all of the legal infrastructure around these mitzvot, which are described in the Torah, but no one knew how to do them for 2,000 years. Based on phenomenal research, he essentially told Jews how to behave in Israel. He was somewhat controversial in that, true to his form, he took sometimes very strict positions. For example, you'll recall when we discussed Rav Kook a few weeks ago, one of the major difficulties of living in Israel on an economic basis was the sabbatical year. One every 7 years, you have to let the land lie fallow. You can't, produce anything off the land. You can't encourage growth. You can't even prepare the land for the next year's growth. You just have to let it grow wild. What do you do with all this stuff here? So according to Rav Kook, he relied on an earlier precedent of what was called the heter mechira, the permission of sale, in which they described a sale of the land to non-Jews, which would somehow exempt it from the prohibition. Many other rabbis, and in particular the Chazon Ish, took huge exception to this. He said, first of all, it's a legal fiction. Nobody is really selling the land. You don't, when you sell your chametz on Pesach, if the non-Jew wants to keep it, he actually does get to keep it. It's true that you expect it back, but in fact, we have lots of precedent of non-Jews saying, you know what, I'd rather have the chametz, and he has to keep it. But the land of Israel, that's not a real sale. You're not selling your land like that. Secondly, who says it's even permitted to sell the land? Who said it's the birthright of the Jewish nation? How can you just sell it to non-Jewish, owners like that? So there are all kinds of objections to it. He said, absolutely not. The land must lie fallow. However, he wasn't just a no person. He realized the economic, stress that's put on the community, and he found halakhic innovations that would allow the land to nevertheless be utilized within an acceptable format. For example, a person could give his entire field to the Jewish court, the Beit Din. And the court could collect up the fruits. There's no prohibition against harvesting the fruits per se. It's just like kind of doing commercial business with them that's the problem, because they are ultimately hefker. They are like anybody who wants them can have them. So the Beit Din can say, okay, we'll go in there, we'll collect up all the oranges, and then we will offer them to people. And the way they would do that, and I lived in Israel and shopped at a store like this, you would go in, let's say you wanted half a dozen oranges, so you'd go in there, and there'd be a whole pile of oranges. You would take as many as you wanted. You should, and then you bring a big plastic bag to the counter. They would not weigh your oranges. The cashier would just sort of eyeball them and would guess a price for you, and you would pay for them, but the payment was really for just the business of keeping the store open and the lights on and people coming to work. You weren't actually paying for the oranges themselves. You could just walk straight out of the store with them if you wanted. But it was like something that would still allow the food to circulate in the state, but with halachic acceptability. There's a lot of other weird things about how the change was handled and stuff like that, but he essentially kept people from starving by allowing these kinds of halachic innovations. That was a weird store, by the way. When you could own, I was studying in Kollel at the time, so as a young man studying full-time in yeshiva, and you had to prove that you were a student in Kollel to be allowed to shop at this store because everything was like subsidized cut rate. And I remember I went in there and I had to fill out this application form, and under children, it had 10 lines. You could really a long sheet there. Okay. They had separate hours for men and women, and there are sometimes Russian women who would show up who were just poor, who were not necessarily in kollel, and they would have like extra skirts around. They would give them skirts so that they could come in and shop there. It was an unusual place. He was also, on a political level, really deeply involved in what Dr. Brown calls the third way in Israeli Haredi politics. And this is an extremely important thing because the Chazon Ish really articulated for Israeli Haredim a way to relate to the state that allowed them to keep their cherished beliefs and at the same time coexist with a very secular governmental apparatus and society. Specifically, let us recall that Israel, as a society, struggles because it's trying to achieve two objectives which are sometimes in conflict with one another. Israel is striving to be a Jewish state. Obviously, that means maintaining a Jewish majority. It means honoring the Jewish calendar, Jewish traditions. The Chazon Ish is right on with all of these things, Torah study and so on. But at the same time, Israel is very committed to being a democratic state, a state in which the majority vote pertains, which sometimes either being democratic or being Jewish, one of those values has to give way. And that applies not only between Jews and their non-Jewish citizens of Israel or the neighbors outside of Israel, but it also applies to religious and non-religious Israelis who often come to terms with, the majority of us in Tel Aviv want to go to the movies on Friday night, but that's not very Jewish, at least in the understanding of the Orthodox. So how do you mitigate those two values? So there were some of the Haredi Jews in Israel, particularly those from the older Yishuv, who wanted to maintain a steadfast opposition to Israel. We see them, for example, in the Neturei Karta movement, kind of an offshoot of the Hasidic Satmar movement. Satmar is not necessarily friendly with Neturei Karta, but they're actively opposed to the state of Israel. Sometimes they engage in these publicity gathering stunts like going to Palestinian political events and things like that. And they're like very staunch opposition to the state and even wishing it ill in many ways. And on the other hand, on the other extreme, you have complete embrace of the state that you find primarily among secular Israelis, and you would also find among Rav Kook's followers, the Mizrahi, for example. By the way, with regards to the Rav Kook and the Shemitah, the sabbatical year things, the Chazon Ish was very, very famous for his very modest dress. He basically wore the same kapota his entire adult life. He refused to have anyone even buy him new clothes. The only way he could live, besides the pittance that he got from his wife's textile efforts, was because there was a very important patron who insisted on having all of his friends and all the other sources that he supported. They all had to buy the Chazon Ish's books. So the Chazon Ish was able to support himself through the sale of his own books, largely because his patron was saying, he won't take money from me directly, so you guys have to buy his books, and that's what kept him going. At any rate, the Chazon Ish wore a shtreimel once in his life, and that's when he went to meet Rav Kook when he first came to Israel. Since Rav Kook had a Hasidic background, the Chazon Ish wore a Hasidic shtreimel at that point. He also, when he first heard Rav Kook speak in a public gathering, he stood the entire time. He refused to sit even for a moment. He stood the entire time. He used the very rare honorific Maran, which means leader of the generation, to apply to Rav Kook. After a few years of living in Israel, however, they had a halachic dispute over several issues, most notably Shemitah, and their relations. It's not that they soured, but the Chazon Ish did not even refer to Rav Kook by name in his important book, essentially disagreeing sharply with Rav Kook's opinion on the Shemitah. But he had tremendous respect for Rav Kook, particularly in those early years. And so anyway, where am I going with all this? The third way. So the Chazon Ish said, we're not going to join with those who oppose the state of Israel. We are not going to join with those who embrace the state of Israel because it's all about Torah. What is the political posture that will most guarantee the unfettered study of Torah. And that is what historians have later called the third way, in which he took kind of a standoffish attitude towards government policies, with the major exception of support for Torah study, because he believed that the real battle in Israeli culture would be won over the study of Torah in the primary and secondary levels of study. So that's really where most Haredim today find their niche and their relationship with the state as a whole. Very much in favor of state subsidies for yeshiva students, for example, but not necessarily enthusiastic support for serving in the armed forces, which can cause a lot of friction, as you could imagine. One of the best examples of this third way was in a famous meeting he had with Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel. And the results of that one very important meeting, in which Ben-Gurion came to see the Chazon Ish in Bnei Brak. You have to imagine this, like Bnei Brak is this tiny little backward town. The Chazon Ish is a person who has never held any official rabbinical post in his life, but nevertheless he was regarded as a sage of Israel. And the Ben-Gurion, the prime minister of this new state, came to him to work out some basic ideas. How are we going to relate to one another? And they had a lot of strong opposition to each other. For example, the Chazon Ish maintained an absolutely firm line in the sand. Women may not serve in the armed forces, and to conscript women would be a complete travesty, and they would go to their deaths to fight such a rule. Many other issues of this nature. The exemption for people who are studying Torah full time, Kolalite, things like that, also on the table. The meeting ended with one really famous story that Ben-Gurion was trying to have his way, saying, "Hey, listen, we're a struggling state. We need your manpower. We need to get some of those guys out of the yeshiva and into the armed forces. How do you expect us to exist?" And so the Chazon Ish said that there's a famous passage in the Talmud: if two camels meet each other at a narrow bridge, and there's only room for one camel to pass at a time, right? One camel comes from the north, the other camel comes from the south, and they're separated by a narrow bridge. Which camel gives way? And the answer to that conundrum is the camel that is laden, meaning the one that's carrying baggage, has priority. The camel that is unladen has to give way. And he says to him, look, I'm carrying the weight of 3,000 years of Jewish tradition. You have to give way to me. And Ben-Gurion did. Ben-Gurion said, okay, that's it. And they created this status quo agreement, which basically lasted the entire 20th century. It eroded significantly the last decade or so, but it was largely a result of the force of personality and the charismatic authority of this small man from Lithuania, small in stature, of course. So his legacy is incredibly important. The Chazon Ish articulated a path of life for Haredim in Israel that allowed that society to flourish and grow beyond, I think, even his wildest imaginations. It also collaborated and corroborated a Haredi way of life in America as well, although obviously with some adaptations to the unique social and economic conditions of this country. His single and unyielding devotion to Torah study often put him at opposition to the greatest rabbis of his era. And nevertheless, his opinion prevailed in many circles, and he is universally revered as a paragon of the unyielding study of Torah as a lifelong pursuit. Thank you very much for coming.
Stand clear of the closing doors, please.